Ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Fathers, everybody else. That wasn't meant to be ambiguous. Okay. Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me. I think I almost have in the two presentations more than I can give and comfortably impart within an hour's time. And thank you for once again bringing my attention to Hermann Sasse. I would not have become a Lutheran had it not been for Sasse. I never met him. I don't think I read much of him while he was still alive, maybe just one or two little articles or something like that. But somebody gave me a copy of the 2 volumes of his collected essays in German, in Statu Confessionis. Werner Klein has now published a 3rd volume, but I'm too cheap to buy it, and we have it in the library anyway. And I read those essays and thought, this is really wonderful. I was Anglican doing a treatise on Luther's Eucharistic theology, but you can be Anglican and fairly Lutheran. In fact, you can be Anglican in all kinds of things. There wasn't really any chance that I would, convert from one confession to another, but Sasse pushed me in that direction. Then I did lots of work on Sasse when I was a young professor. We had the International Hermann Sasse Symposium at the St. Catharines Seminary in the fall of 1995. Robert Price came and did something for us, and he went home and simply dropped dead a few days later. I worked on him then, and because I love Sasse, I like to get into it, but I always think I've, sort of passed that point in life. And then a couple of years ago, the Germans in the Zelk were doing, they called it a Festschrift for his 125th birthday. Now, I think that's odd because a Festschrift is in honor of a living person, a Denkschrift in honor of a dead person. But I suppose they were celebrating his 125th birthday. Now, I could go on with stories about that, but if I do, I won't get through a third of the lecture. But anyway, Werner Klein, who's been a professor with us in his retirement, wonderful man. I think he is the leading scholar of the Zelk. He edited this Festschrift, so-called, and I got into it again. And then I just did something for our clergy conference, a rather different paper on Sasse and the Third Reich. And I was drawing connections to contemporary Canada, and some people didn't like that. Our clergy in Canada are very deeply divided. We have big conflicts going on right now. I'm very much and very vociferous on one side of those conflicts. Then Father Charles invited me. Now, tomorrow I'm going to talk about Sasse as a whole, and so get a bit more into his origins and touch base with various parts of his theology. Today, the only part of his theology we really get into is the relationship between the civil authority and the spiritual authority that resides in the church. That's really all we're going to do today. So we're not going to look at Sasse in the whole of his theology. Now, as we address the topic, Hermann Sasse and the Third Reich, your speaker and his hearers must reacquaint ourselves with the bottom line definition of totalitarianism. Now, of course, I was born in 1953. At 6 weeks old, I was held in front of the television to watch the Queen's coronation. So I've been a royalist since then, although I have to say the succeeding generations that are coming down the line, they anfechten, they tempt inherent monarchism. So that's not good. And anyway, those of you who grew up in my generation, Father Charles's was even a little further advanced. The Second World War was all my elders talked about for the first 15 years of my life. Now, then around 1970, they switched to other topics and they forgot all about it, except when the older men would have flashbacks. But of course, in, say, Great Britain, Western Europe, in North America, everybody thought, well, we vanquished totalitarianism. It is entirely of the past. There's no way it could come back and threaten us. And above all, it could never threaten us on our home turf. Well, in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, I saw him in my last year at Oxford and didn't even know who Tolkien was. But Tolkien says evil gets suppressed and it kind of sinks down, and then you wait a couple of generations and it pops up in another form. You know, what goes around comes around, and it reminds me, one spring I decided I was going to be a really vigorous gardener again, and I was standing in a garden center and had to take that great theological discussion of a decision of enormous spiritual import. Do I have cow manure or moo poo? And as I was pondering this decision, a sales clerk was whizzing down behind me, and I asked her, what's the difference? And this young woman just said, same crap, different rap. Well, that's kind of what happens in history, I think. So the bad stuff, it keeps repeating. And when we think that, oh, we vanquished Hitler and it could never happen again, how stupid we are. If history doesn't repeat itself, Mark Twain is said to have said it rhymes. There are rhymes that we can hear right now. Now, the need to define totalitarianism properly arises not simply in order that we might understand aright the history of the last century, but above all, in order that we may accurately read the pulse of the present. For the last 2 years have seen a catastrophic intensification of a totalitarianizing process in Western societies that has been going on for the last several generations, a process that was already gathering speed in the societal changes of the 1960s. Well, again, if you're almost 70, you kind of have a faint recollection of what life was like before the 60s got into top gear. And then you had 1968, which changed everything. And in German and French, a 68er, that has been a word for the longest time. Someone is ein 68er or a 68er. And I've noticed in English, in the last few years, we've been talking about 68ers. Now, those of you who are considerably younger, and my president colleague and really good friend, Tom Winger, was born in 65. So obviously, it has all the damage had been done by the time he starts significantly to remember things. Now, I think this totalitarianization process is a little grimmer, and it is more advanced in Canada than it is in our giant neighbor here to the south. You see, the US separation of powers, that's very significant, I think. And the American people's love, their gut love for plain old liberty, they currently put you in a stronger position than we are in. I'm going to scream next time I hear a fellow Canadian, whether Christian or otherwise, counsel me from behind a face diaper to stay safe. It's driving me crazy. There's a gentleman a little older than I am who's chairman of a philosophy department, and he tells me to stay safe. Well, he always has Liberal Party signs. He's really left-wing. We visit pleasantly, and I realize it's not going to be worth having a fight with them about it because, you know, people of that age don't change their opinions. unlike open-minded people, of my vintage. Now, my wife and I, at no time have we experienced the Wuhan virus as an existential threat, but the same cannot be said with regard to our Prime Minister's clearly articulated admiration for the basic dictatorship conducted by the Chinese Communist Party. I feel much more unsafe vis-a-vis that than I do vis-a-vis getting a cold. Now, in 1936, Sasse, who was a much harassed and a greatly under pressure professor in Erlangen, he wrote a confidential letter to President Ludwig Furbringer Sr. Of the St. Louis Seminary. He had to arrange to have that missive smuggled through Switzerland. And then when it got to the United States, Furbringer was to take a few copies and send it on to people like the Synod president in St. Louis and the German who was teaching for the Iowa Synod, and he wrote stuff on the Catechism, and his name has escaped me. He was born in Bavaria. John Michael Roy. Yeah. Now, relevantly to our present situation, in this long letter, which just appeared in a Bavarian church history magazine in German, Harrison needs to arrange to have it properly translated. Sasse says, he notes how in Germany, we all, professors and pastors, are standing with one foot in prison. Now, he says we all, he means those who agree with him. The great majority, of course, of professors, they were marching along, goose-stepping and giving their Heil Hitler salutes. And a good half of the pastors were really doing the same thing. But he says he's writing to Furbringer, in case one day a similar revolution breaks out in your own country. Well, up to a generation ago, even 20 years ago, we'd have said, no, impossible, couldn't happen. Now, permit me then to define totalitarianism in the words of a contributor to the 2020 Festschrift in honor of Sasse, the Australian Maurice Schildt, who was a student in Adelaide. He says, the totalitarian state is a state which lays claim to man in the totality of his being, which declares its own authority to be the source of all authority, which refuses to recognize the independence in their own sphere of religion, culture, education, and the family. Well, in Roman Catholic social ethics, that's the principle of subsidiarity. If it can be looked after at a lower level, it doesn't have to be dictated to by the higher level, which seeks to impose on all its citizens a particular philosophy of life, and which sets out to create, by means of the agencies of public information and education, a particular type of man in accordance with its own understanding of the meaning and end of man's existence. And then I believe this is a Sasse quote, a state which advances such claims declares itself to be not only a state, but also a church. Now, there's a major study of the churches in the Third Reich in 2 volumes. The author died young before he could complete it. He's pretty far to the left theologically, but a good historian. He has a definition, totalitarianism, this theory saw the new order as determined by a single uniform will, the formative power of which was to extend into all areas of life, down to their remotest ramifications. Now, this view where you see the political authority thinks it's the source of authority, you certainly saw that in 20th century totalitarianism. It's a little risky down here in the state of Maryland, I guess, but one of my favorite historical figures is good King George, one of the most virtuous sovereigns Britain and Canada ever had, who most certainly wasn't a tyrant. I have fights with my son-in-law, Stephen Price, about that now and again. No way Jose was George a tyrant. He believed in his English constitution and that, you know, he had to act as the king in parliament, not as the arbitrary king. But George III attended church every Sunday at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, where Prince Philip had his funeral. And George would take the collection, and then he would go up to the altar with the collection, and the king would do 3 profound bows, such as people would give him. And my back today feels I couldn't really quite do that bow. It goes pretty low, but he would do 3 bows toward the altar and then give the officiating priest the collection plate. Well, the ceremony kind of got across the point. He's acknowledging an authority above him. Now, the problem in this woke revolution is there is no authority above the woke people. That's the horrific thing about it. Now, so I think just from the point of view of language, we have to voice a very strong protest against today's sloppy verbal habits of treating the terms fascist and Nazi as synonyms. See, Hitler was not actually a fascist. Mussolini was the architect of fascism. But Mussolini's fascism was a rather mild form of 20th century totalitarianism. And Mussolini was a bit of a joke, a comedian who ended up being of most danger to himself. Now, General Franco's variant of fascism in Spain was milder still. It was simply old-fashioned Catholic patriarchal authoritarianism. Now, in my manuscript, I say Soviet communism was worst of all, with Hitler's National Socialism a close runner-up. Well, people who lived under both and suffered under both would probably say it was about equal if you actually had to live under it. Much worse, of course, if you were of Jewish ethnicity. Now, conceptual laziness and imitation of the late Dr. Goebbels is at work when positions distinct from the prevalent cultural Marxism are caricatured as somehow fascist. And that, you know, tends to be the insult that's thrown if someone on the woke left doesn't like your argument. Now, I'll talk more about Sasse in his background tomorrow, but quite the most remarkable feature of Hermann Sasse's testimony against Hitler and his movement is how he identified and confronted their danger well before the Führer seemed likely to come to power. It's not until, you know, when Germany's in terrible crisis, all of a sudden in 1930, Hitler gets 30% of the vote. It's not until then that anyone would have thought of him as other than a sick comedian. Now, after that point, it's then a slippery slide, and things go desperately. Now, by way of contrast to Sasse, many of those who went on to distinguish themselves in the Kirchenkampf, the church struggle, either they cheered Hitler along as he became chancellor and began to implement his policies, or they had even been card-carrying National Socialists for up to a decade before the Führer took power on the 30th of January, 1933. No less a figure than Martin Niemöller. Well, Niemöller has had a whole publicity industry, you know, to promote him. He was a fellow traveler and remained a fellow traveler for quite a while, just purely politically, as was his likewise ordained brother, who had been a National Socialist for the last 10 years. Now, Sasse and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they belonged to the very select club of those Lutherans who smelt a rat while the others were breathing in sweet fragrance. Now, you wonder how did Hitler managed to gain office according to constitutional procedures? And then how was he able to make sure that nobody could wrest power from his hands? Now, the Nazis, when Hitler took power, they were able to spin his appointment as chancellor by President von Hindenburg. Von Hindenburg descended directly from Luther's younger daughter. Only 2 of Luther's 6 children had children. And the younger daughter didn't live that long, but she had children. She married into the minor nobility. That was the rank of Hindenburg, who did not like Hitler at all. But it was spun, and they called it die Machtergreifung, the seizure of power. And what they persuaded people was there was about to be a communist revolution in Germany, and Hitler was the only one who saved the day. And well, he had to do a few nasty things, but he had to do this to stabilize the situation. And then he would turn out to be really quite nice. Now, within a couple of months, Hitler, by the way, had held the last free election, still didn't get an absolute majority. But then he turned he turned Germany into a one-party, hence totalitarian state. And it's just amazing, the German political class, who had been so strong in the Weimar Republic, they switched into passive mode. Well, Hitler outlawed the communists, imprisoned a lot of them. Other communists kind of said, well, if we can't have our kind of totalitarianism, we'll cooperate with yours. So some communists simply went over and became Nazis, but the Social Democrats got shut down. Then you had the Catholic Center Party that at the last free election, it gained 11% of the vote. They all meekly acquiesced in being shut down for the one-party state. It's really quite amazing. How did he achieve all of this while his own party received less than 44% of all votes cast? So technically, they needed a coalition to have a majority in the Reichstag. Well, what you do is you suspend the Constitution and you bypass the Reichstag, and then there's nothing anybody can do about it. Why did this happen? Well, first of all, rightful German patriotism turned into poisoned nationalism as a result of the Second Reich's unexpected military implosion in the summer and fall of 1918. Sasse, too, lamented the terms of the Versailles Treaty dictated by President Woodrow Wilson, which brought misery to Germany in a decade of universal economic downturn that culminated in the Wall Street crash. It was terrible for everybody in Europe. For the Germans, it was even worse because they were told they had unique guilt for the Second World War and they had to pay very heavy reparations. Now, against the background of Wilson's fond belief that enactment of a universal national right of self-determination would produce a better world, I recently read an article that argued Central Europe could right now use a very large state just where the Austro-Hungarian Empire used to be. Now, I'm not sure anybody's ever going to rehabilitate the Hohenzollerns, but the Habsburgs actually were not tyrants. And Franz Joseph, the last Kaiser, ended up sort of being nice to everybody and sort of patronizing every religion. You know, Roman Catholicism, every form of Protestantism. At the very end, he was even being nice to Islam. And he was basically just sort of behaving like a British constitutional monarch, going around getting out of carriages and shaking hands with people, you see. And actually, it was not an oppressive state. The Hungarian side was a bit rough if you weren't Hungarian. On the German side, they were very, very careful to respect the rights of every little minority you could think of. This poisoned nationalism, it was exacerbated to infinity by the racism of the so-called Folkish movement. German can be hard to translate. Evangelisch can mean of the gospel. If a certain kind of German is using it, it means genuinely Lutheran. It can also mean sort of Protestant. And if another kind of German is using it, it kind of means North American evangelical. So when you see evangelisch, well, you have to work out what does it mean as that person is using it. Well, folk is, well, folk, we have that word, people, and it can be a word you use for nation. Now, from the 19th century in Germany, folk, and then the adjective Völkisch, it had a racial sense about it, which other cultures did not have to quite the same degree, even though I'd have to admit, I mean, the French believed in the superiority of native Frenchmen as they imposed French culture. And Winston Churchill, you know, when he would talk about the English-speaking peoples, he wasn't thinking about the Jamaicans. So a couple of generations ago, everybody else had a bit of a racial sense when they used their terms. Now, in Germany, it gets very poisonous because what happens is, particularly in light of the unexpected defeat in World War I, you look for a scapegoat. Well, you have a very large Jewish minority. And it was so large because Germany was one of the better places for Jews to live. That's why there were so many of them for Hitler to kill, which is the tragic horror of it. But the ethnic children of Abraham are not the only Untermenschen, subhumans, to blame for Germany's ills. Anybody of Slav descent, so Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, Czechoslovakian, Slovakian, all the rest of it, Serbians, they're very second class. Now, this Folkish movement became very, very, very poisonous. You've probably heard of Paul Althaus, who was the Luther scholar. Now, his book, Theology of Martin Luther, The Ethics of Martin Luther, very, very useful, gives you all kinds of quotes and really a good interpretive framework. He died in 1966 in great glory, basking as a grand old man who was such a nice, civilized man. Ooh, Althaus has a very dirty reputation in the 1930s. And I've been thinking, there's all kinds of books like Althaus and Ehlers. I need to either store them separately or turn them around, you know, so you don't see the book cover, because they really disgrace themselves. Paul Althaus was remembered by his former student, Helmut Thielicke, as a well-to-do professor who had servants living in at home, so he and his wife didn't do anything. And also, he's a very conceited academic, and a German Herr Professor has Assistenten, who may either have their doctorate or they're working on their doctorate, and they basically, you know, do everything but help the professor in the washroom. You know what I mean? They're very lowly beings. They're a class of Untermenschen in German academic life. Well, they had to run ahead as he was coming to his lecture hall to tell the students to applaud. In Germany, you don't do this, you do this. Well, Althaus wouldn't come into the room unless he was getting lots of applause. So that shows you what an ego the guy has. Now, he, by the way, in 1927, he addressed a giant synod convention, a Kirchentag, a big gathering of the church, clergy and laity, like a Missouri Synod convention. I'll get into that stuff a bit more tomorrow. It was held in Königsberg, capital of Prussia, East Prussia, in 1927. Now, he decided this was the Folkish thing was a ball he'd better bring into play and kick. And we had to use this in the church. And what he said was, we must develop in the Evangelische Kirche of a German form of Christianity, which isn't there for people of other ethnicities. Now, he kept going with that until around late 1933, 1934. He started to see where it might go, and he ceased his public support. But he is the one who got this thing going. Now, it's very dangerous indeed. What's interesting is it was already at the end of the First World War, he began to articulate this. And he did this in an address to the clergy of the Warsaw consistorial district of the Prussian Union. Now, you see, much of Poland had been under German suzerainty. And even when he's got lots and lots, majority Poles living around him, he's saying, well, we have to be German and we have to propound a German form of Christianity. What's interesting is there had been a synod of clergy in 1905 in Poland. It ruled that the pastor has to place himself above nationalities. He is not a politician, but a pastor of souls. His task is neither Germanization nor Polandization, but the faithful proclamation of the gospel, in which he must, as far as possible, do justice to each nationality. Now, that's before they lose the war. After the war, we've got to put Germans first. Well, that's Deutschland über alles. That's in the national anthem, after all. Now, very dangerous stuff. Now, the pulpit from which Sasse was able to dissect Nazism's errors before the party's seizure of power arose from his holding the editorship of the much-read Kirchliches Jahrbuch from 1931 to 1934, Churchly Yearbook, not the same thing as the Missouri Synod Annual. If I ever go to Germany again, I want to go to a university library and see what this Kirchliches Jahrbuch is all about. It has an editor. It gives you all kinds of up-to-date information, and it has substantive theological essays. So 1 year, see, Sasse is editor 31 to 34, so a year into his being professor in Erlangen, and 1 year he gives a long introductory essay on German Protestantism from 1919 to the present, to 1930, where he dissects everything, presents it, thinks about it. Now, the Jahrbuch was to give Kunde. Well, Kunde is knowledge. If you are kundiger in whatever you are sachkundig. You are knowledgeable in your field. Like this young man who is the server today is a biologist or something, aren't you? A biochemist. Well, I wouldn't know the difference, to be honest with you. So he's sachkundig as a biologe. Well, it has the sense, in German, Bibelkunde is to know the Bible basics. Before you do your theology, you know David and Goliath. Our Old Testament man, some years ago, said something about David and Goliath, and the students asked him, who's David and Goliath? And he said, it's not April the 1st, you're being funny, aren't you? And well, no, we had students who didn't know who David and Goliath were. Well, in this, we don't have the Bibelkunde, those basics. Well, Sasse is a very high-class journalist, very lucid. But he'll give you the facts, and then he interprets the facts. Well, in the 1931 edition, he paints a target on his back as Sasse has an essay on the meaning of the state, and he tears apart this whole Folkish thing. Now, the first time I read it, I thought, well, that's nice. He talks about the authorities, the people, that's nice. Now I realize it's an electric discussion because, an awful lot is invested in this. And the Nazis never forgave him for this essay. Now, Article 24 of the Nazi Party program said, the party stands for a positive Christianity, ein positives Christentum above the confessions, and Christianity is fine so long as it does not offend the moral sensibilities of the Germanic race. Sasse analyzed that and said, if they ever get the chance to implement this, the church will be persecuted. And then he looks in, what makes a people a people? And he says, it's not your DNA, it is not your race. He says, all the European peoples are a mixture of just about everything. And he says, it's not only religion and culture. He says, in Germany, we're bitterly divided at that time between the 2/3 Protestant majority, the 1/3 Catholic minority. And he looks at other things and says, it's not this, this, and this. And he says, something happens which kind of gives a call of God for people to come together in one state. And they may be very different from each other. And then he says, if they forget that call of God, then they're on the road to disaster. Now, and Sasse, I love this quotation. However much it is inwardly bound up with its own people, the church of a people and a country is not there to sprinkle religious stardust over volkstum and state, but rather it is to place the nation before God and call it to repentance and faith. And each national and territorial church ceases to be a church of Christ when it no longer upholds the connection to the universal church. I think he puts that very well. Now, conversely, Althaus blew oxygen and poured fuel on the Nazi fire. Sasse says he functions as the one who prepares the way, the Wegbereiter, for the German Christian faith movement that laid low the Evangelische Kirche in 1933. Now, just as the Nazis are becoming really powerful, people in the churches say, we've got to get in with the program. Well, especially in the Evangelisch Church, far, far fewer in the Roman Church. And they founded the German Christian faith movement, the Glaubensbewegung Deutsche Christen. They were a big fright. Within a month or so of taking power, Hitler modified the civil service law. He implemented the notorious Aryan paragraph. And that said, if you were of Jewish descent, you could not become, nor could you continue as a civil servant. And because the clergy of both confessions were paid by the state, if you have Jewish blood, you cannot be a Roman priest or any kind of Protestant pastor. So Hubert Jedin was a German Roman Catholic, half Jewish. He ended up being spirited into the Vatican, where Pius XII had him live in a closet somewhere, and he wrote his great history of the Council of Trent there. Not safe for him to go back. One of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's closest friends was Franz Hildebrand, who was really quite a guy. He's of Jewish extraction. He fled, he's a Lutheran pastor. He fled over to England, became a Methodist pastor. I remember a lady in Cambridge telling me, oh, Reverend Hildebrand wrote such a nice letter to my sister, to my mother when my sister died. And he went off and did various things. I met his daughter once. Now, just at the time that Sasse was joining the Erlangen faculty, the faculty issued a Gutachten. Well, a Gutachten is a formal opinion by an authoritative body. So we call it a faculty opinion. In the old days, if you had a theological question, you asked the faculties. Now you ask the CTCR because you need an expensive and redundant bureaucracy. And if you don't get the right answer, you then ask the faculties anyway, and you keep asking until you get the right answer. That's what you do. Well, anyway, pious Lutherans had asked, can we accept the Aryan paragraph in the church? They asked two universities, Marburg and Erlangen. Marburg, the faculty unanimously said, the Aryan paragraph is against Christian Lutheran dogma, and anyone who accepts it doesn't know what the church is, because the church, by definition, is composed of Jews and Gentiles. And if you throw the Jews out, that's the equal and opposite error to Paul's Judaizers. Rudolf Bultmann sat on that faculty. Now, we think of him as having a very high place in our demonology because he was so liberal in all his higher criticism. But actually, he went with the confessing church, and he saw that very clearly that, well, no, we can't uphold the Aryan paragraph. Erlangen, as I'll give you tomorrow, that is the citadel of a more orthodox Lutheranism. They're very proud of themselves and of their status. Werner Ehlert, who has a worse reputation, I think, than Althaus, and Paul Althaus, they drew up a faculty Gutachten, which said what the state wanted to hear, that, yeah, the state is quite right to do this to protect the German people. So we have to get rid of our Jewish pastors, and nobody with any Jewish blood may register among the student body. I love, there was a wit who went to a concentration camp. He had a joke. You see, the pastor goes to the altar and he says quietly, everyone of non-Aryan race must leave the church. A bit louder. Everyone of non-Aryan race must leave the church immediately. Then he says it a third time. And Christ comes down off the cross and walks out of the church. The Third Reich didn't appreciate the humor for some reason.